Amen. All right, what book are we in? What chapter are we in? What's our main theme? All right, we're off to a good start. Now comes the hard question. Right now, what is he better than? What thing are we studying him being better than? Yeah, that's what I thought. We're talking about how Jesus is better than the whole Jewish system. That's the culmination of Hebrews. It's not really the culmination. There's one more step when he really starts throwing shade. But right now we're at Christ is better than the whole Jewish system. The culmination being the tabernacle, which is why we got the little prop set up. We're not there just yet, but we're going to talk about that in a second. But we're going to start here. We last week we covered the culmination of how he's better than Melchizedek. We got into the sticks about who Melchizedek is, and we're moving on today. We're not talking about Melchizedek right now. We're talking about specifically Jesus as a priest. And we'll just begin in verse 1 if somebody could read it. All right. Now, sometimes it's very convenient when we're reading a longer book like Hebrews. Hebrews is one of the longest epistles, arguably the longest epistle in case you're including Revelation. But it's a very long epistle, and it's convenient that he starts here in chapter 8 and says, this is the sum, meaning of everything we've said, here's a recap, right? And he says specifically that we have a high priest who sat at the right hand of the throne of majesty in the heavens, meaning our priest, who is Jesus, right? Our priest is in heaven, seated at the right hand of the Father, the majesty in the heavens. So why is this significant? Well, first of all, it means that our high priest is a little bit different than every other high priest, because every other priest ever was on earth, right? Our high priest is in heaven, meaning there's no lag between him and the Father. There's no, well, we got to make sure he goes before God in a very careful and meticulous way, else he's smo dead. He just turns to the left and goes, hey, Dad. And problem solved, right? I mean, it's a convenient, isn't it where all of us would like to be? Just at the right hand of God. You ever have a problem, you just go, hey, Dad. And you're good. Problem solved. And that's what he's talking about. He's at the right hand of the majesty in the heavens. Right? And then he goes on in verse 2. Somebody read it. All right, now he mentions something interesting. He says that he's a minister of the true tabernacle, right? The true tabernacle. He says, which the Lord pitched. And now this term pitched there's a lot of different things that means pitch, right? You pitch a roof, you seal it up. He's talking about pitching a tent, right? You pitch a tent, you set up all the bones of it, and you put the tent over the top. Or if you have a new one, you stick all the bones through, and then you bend them up, and you make a tent, right? So he's saying there's this other tabernacle, which is what this was called, right? The tabernacle is this tent-like structure where the old church used to meet, where the Jews used to meet. And then it moved on into the temple. And when he moved on to the temple, they didn't call it the tabernacle anymore, even though it really still was. It served the same purpose. But he's saying there's another tabernacle that God pitched, implying, and we're about to see more than an implication, but implying that there is a house of God that God made, not one that man made. Right? God laid out, told him how to build it, but still man made it. But there's one that God made. Right? So he says that's the tabernacle that Jesus is the temple, that Jesus is the priest of. Not one made by man, but one higher than man's. And he goes on in verse 3. Somebody go ahead and read it. All right, let's go ahead and let's do our fanciness real quick. Go ahead, brother. Boom. Here's our tabernacle. All right. So here's this tabernacle, right? Here is our altar. This is where they used to bring these, they got a little cow here. They used to burn the cows and the sheep and the goats and the pigeons and everything on that altar right there. What he's saying is that's what every priest was told to do. That's the whole purpose of a priest, was to offer a sacrifice right there. He says, well, by logic, every high priest must offer a sacrifice. And one of them is Jesus. So he also needed to offer a sacrifice. Well, Jesus didn't come along and offer some burnt cow like a lame priest might do, but he offered himself on the cross, which is a better altar. Okay, and when he offered himself upon the cross, he purged all sins. We'll go ahead and leave it on the tabernacle for now. And then he goes on in verse 4. Somebody go ahead and read that. He says if Jesus was on earth, he would not be a priest. Now, think about what he's saying. You would say by logic, if Jesus is a priest in heaven, then if he is on earth, he would also still be a priest. And he says, no, he wouldn't be a priest. Why? Because all of these priests offer sacrifices according to a law. The law that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's what we call the law, the first 5 books of the Bible. He says all priests that are on earth do things according to that law. But Jesus did not do things according to that law. And also the law said he couldn't be a priest, which is another issue with the law. So he could not be a priest on earth because he offered a different kind of sacrifice than the one written in the law. And so he continues on in verse 5. Somebody read that. Okay, this is a direct quote from Exodus 25 and 40 when he says, everything you do should be according to the pattern shown to you on the mount. What is he saying? Well, this is a great example. This is the main reason I brought it. It wasn't the rest of that stuff. It was this right here. This right here, I don't want to be in the shot. All right, this right here is the tabernacle, right? In the same way that the old tabernacle was a tabernacle. What I mean is, this thing right here is literally as true a tabernacle as the tabernacle that they built there in the wilderness. Why? Because he says, build it all according to the pattern shown to thee in the mount. Meaning, they were next to Sinai, this big, huge mountain. Wasn't that tall. But in their eyes, it was huge. We're Americans, so it was kind of a small little hill. It's probably not even as tall as our Franklin Mountains. But in their eyes, ooh, great mountain, right? But they walked out of Egypt, they get to this mountain, and God begins to consume the mountain. He says only Moses is going to come up. Moses walks up the mountain, and God gives him the law, gives him all sorts of things. And one of the things he gives him is the blueprints for the tabernacle. And evidently, God not only gave him the blueprints, but also gave him a vision of what it was supposed to look like. Which is why, if you ever read through the law, there's not a lot of good explanations for the tabernacle. They're all very loose, and it's all very, this is the dimensions, and it kind of looks like this, but there's never, make it look like this exact thing. Why? Because he just showed it to him and said, make it. So there was no need to have all the words written down. And one of the things that most people agree is that somehow Moses saw the real tabernacle. And what he's saying is that served as a shadow, in the same way that we're using this as a shadow, right, of the tabernacle that once was. In the same way, that tabernacle was a shadow of the real tabernacle in heaven. All right, we're done with tabernacle. That was all I needed to say. This toy was as much the tabernacle as the real tabernacle. Because the real tabernacle was based on another tabernacle. And so, you want to know, why is it we don't go around and do this? We don't. Have you ever thought about that? There's all these books in the Bible given to how to operate in the tabernacle, how it's supposed to be built, how the preacher's supposed to operate. All of this information, and then all of a sudden the New Testament comes along and we just ignore all of it? You ever wondered why? It seems like there was a waste of information. Well, the truth is, everything that had to do with the tabernacle in the Old Testament was children's church. Because it was all just an image of the real thing, where Jesus is operating right now. in the heavenlies. That's why we don't keep playing with the children's church tabernacle when we have the real high priest who did the real sacrifice, who does the real work in heaven. We don't need a bunch of guys to walk around and get bloody with goat blood. Who cares? We have a real priest, and we don't need to all play with animals anymore. That's what they were doing. They were playing with carcasses. They weren't actually doing anything that pleased God. Even they say, read it later in this book. He says he wasn't pleased with all these rams and all this blood and all this sacrifice. He needed one good, real sacrifice. So everything else was just the game. So then, that was all the pattern. But then he goes on in verse 6, and then we leave the tabernacle to verse 6. So what's verse 6? Somebody. Okay. He says he's got a better ministry, one that leaves off the tabernacle, one that says, all right, we're done with the tabernacle, we're moving forward, a more excellent ministry than all the other priests had. And he says how much also he's the mediator of a better covenant. This was the old covenant that established the whole tabernacle. He says now we have a better covenant, and mainly is that it is established upon a better promise. What's the better promise? We're about to get there. That's about what we're about to teach. This is the main portion of the chapter. It's about the better promise. The old covenant's promise was that God would be with them. And it would seem, if you were of that era, that that was the highest form of promise, right? God's going to be with me. In the most simple level mind of God, that's the greatest promise, is that God would be with you. But that's kind of a funny promise because God's everywhere. He has all power, all presence, all knowledge, all everything. So a promise that God's going to be with you is not actually that great. It's just a base level promise, which is exactly what he's saying. It was not that great of a promise. He's got a better ministry, a better mediator, a better covenant, and a better promise. And then he goes on in verse 7. Somebody read that. Okay, he says, so the old covenant, everything in the Old Testament, if it was perfect, if it was exactly the best method and best everything, then there would be no need for a second, right? Just by logic, if you get the perfect vehicle, you don't need another vehicle. But it's not that perfect, is it? That's why you need another one. Right. If you had a perfect computer, you wouldn't need another computer, but it's not perfect, so you need another one. And so it is with everything in life, right? If it was perfect, you wouldn't need another one. That's why men are the happiest people on the planet, right? Because they get married and they have a perfect wife and they don't need another one. And if you need another one, you need to get saved. But the point is, we're moving on. He says, if the first one was perfect, you wouldn't need a second one, right? And so therefore, there must have been a need for a second one. And he goes on in verse 8. Somebody read it. Okay, now you'll notice he begins to go into another verse, but it begins with the author of this epistle writing when he says, for finding fault with them. Finding fault with who? The old law. So he's, by saying everything that's about to be said, he's finding fault with the old law by logic because he says, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, I will make a new covenant. So if God's going to make a new covenant, it's because the old covenant wasn't that great or wasn't perfect. It's not that it wasn't great. It actually was great. And this is sometimes why we preachers have a funny way of talking about the old covenant. Because the old covenant was really one of the most impressive things that had ever been given to man. It just wasn't perfect. It was actually kind of great. It was the first law that God ever gave man to govern man, to tell him how to live, gave him good laws. To this day, every civilized group of people base their laws on the old law. It's not like it was a powerless law. Everybody before the law was uncivilized. You know how we know that? Look at Pharaoh. Pharaoh was supposed to be the pinnacle of civilization at his time. And he's an idiot. If somebody threatens to kill your kid, what do? you at least kill them. Yet, even after his son dies, he has no way of actually grounding anything in reality. He says, oh, we'll let him go. We won't let him go. You're like, dude, figure it out. They just wrecked you. He's not that civilized, and he's the pinnacle of civilization at the time. But then God gives them the law, and all of a sudden Israel becomes the pinnacle of civilization, so much so everybody wants to destroy them. And then everybody that takes over, when they wisen up, go, we should build our society upon their laws. Which is exactly what a lot of the successful ones did. They turned to the God of Israel. So therefore, it's not a powerless law. But he says, I'm still going to make a new one because it's not perfect. It's not the way I want it to be. And everything here comes from Jeremiah 31, verses 31 through 34. This whole portion of Bible reading, when he says, behold, the days will come, all of this is from there. And then he goes on in verse 9. Somebody read it. Okay, so now this is a direct reference out of Exodus 19 when God gives Moses basically the completion of the covenant. He says, go to the people, and if they will keep my covenant, then I will be with them and I will bless them. And they say, we will keep every word that the Lord has spoken. And then proceed to not keep any of the words that the Lord had spoken. So therefore, God says, the agreement was, if you keep the law, I'll bless you. You didn't keep the law, so therefore, I won't bless you. And he says, so therefore, now I need a new covenant because they broke the old covenant. Now, the new covenant is based on something different, though. It's the same thing that Abraham's covenant was based on and Jacob's covenant was based on. It's these old covenants. You say, I don't really know what you're talking about, Pastor. The covenant basis was on this. God said he would do it, and he didn't care what they did. That's basically the covenant with Abraham. God made a covenant with himself. And so it is with Jacob. So it was with Isaac, and so it is with all of the true Israel, where God said, I will do this, and I don't care what you do. I'm blessing you. You just have to, and this is the hinging part that a lot of people have a hard time with, you have to accept it. That's the key part of the covenant of God, is you have to accept his covenant. But that's it. You just have to accept it. But he's saying, I'm going to give them a new covenant. And he says, not according to the covenant that I made. He's doubling down on the fact that this is a different covenant. It is a new covenant. It's not the old covenant. And it is because they didn't do what they were supposed to do. He says, so I regarded them not, saith the Lord. And then he continues on. Verse 10, somebody read it. Okay, he'll make, this is the new covenant, right? He even says it. And this is the covenant that I will make. He says, first things first. He says, I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts. And this right here is what, the culmination of what Jesus was doing on the cross. He was moving the law from paper to the heart. Right? Have you ever, throughout your Bible, you may come across these references where it's talking about the fleshly stone of the heart or the fleshly heart. And what he's talking about is the old covenant was written on stone, literally was written on stone. That was how it was written down. And then later on, it would be written on paper. And now today, we even still have it written on paper to a degree. But what the problem was is the men were trying to build their lives on this thing written on paper. But the paper could not make men good, right? It doesn't matter how much you write on paper, you cannot make men good. As I was recently listening to these men, they were talking about laws and how they should be established, and they said, what would you rather? Would you rather there be a law that said you could have freedom of speech, or would you rather it just be a social norm that you have freedom of speech? And the guy said, well, I would prefer it was a social norm. He said, but the problem is social norms are not absolute, right? Social norms change. He says, for example, would you rather, and this is a good point, would you rather live in a society where it was illegal to kill somebody or where people didn't kill anybody? He says, well, obviously you just rather live in the society where no one kills anybody. And this is the problem with the law, It told you everything you couldn't do, but men still did it. And so he says, now I'm going to change it, and instead of it just being on paper, I'm going to write it on their hearts. I'm going to put it in their minds. And then I will be to them a God. Not because he wasn't God before, but because people's eyes were closed and shut and they weren't open, so he wasn't really their God. Instead, he was just God, and they were just doing their thing. He says, but I will be, finally, because the law will be on their hearts, I'll be to them a God, and they will, by decision, choose to be to me a people. And everything will be right, and everything will be perfect, because it'll be the way it was planned to be. And then, when that is fully complete, now sometimes you have to think, you got to make sure you're following everything all the way, right? That's the initial part, and then what does he say in verse 11? This is the culmination of the new covenant. Now, that one is not complete, right? Obviously, we're still telling people to know the Lord, because why? They don't. Right? He says, but there will come the day when all of this is complete, and when everybody that is saved, and everything else is done away with. This is later on down the road. We can talk about Revelation later, but not tonight. Right? He says, when all this is finished, we won't need to everybody say, hey, you need to know the Lord. I got to tell you about my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Why? Because they'll go, why? I already know him. We're good. First of all, we're in heaven. Chill. You don't need to keep telling us. I talked to him this morning, actually. We're all right, right? And then I'm sure there will be one guy walking around going, know the Lord. But he'll just be one of those funny guys. They're always around, right? But the point is, he says that won't be necessary because everybody will know the Lord. Everything will be perfect. Everything will be complete because the law will be in their hearts. And this is still all right out of Jeremiah in verse 12. Somebody go ahead and read it. He says, I'll be merciful to their unrighteousness, meaning I'll forgive them. That's the next part, right? He says, I'll remember it no more. I won't remember their sins. I won't remember their iniquities. It'll be blotted out. I'll have forgiven them because they'll have turned to me. The law will be in their hearts. I'll be their God. They'll be my people. Everything will be right, and I won't remember their sins, which is an exact flip-flop from Exodus 20 in verse 5 when he says, if you guys touch the unclean thing, I'll basically remember the iniquities of the fathers upon the third and fourth generation. Meaning, if you guys mess with this and you guys keep doing it now, even then, what he meant was not that he was just going to curse the next generation for no reason. But if dad does it, his kid's probably going to do it, and his kid's probably going to do it, and his kid's probably going to do it. And so therefore the curse is passed down. There's no such thing in the Bible as a generational curse. It's not there anywhere. What is the curse? You did what dad did. That's the curse. It's not because there's a special curse. It's because you brought the curse. That's everywhere in the Bible. That's what it's talking about. It's even what he's talking about there. But he's saying at this point, because the sins will be gone, I won't remember their iniquity. Their kid's not going to be doing it because the law is going to be in the kid's heart, and everything's going to be right. Everything will be perfect. And so I won't remember their iniquities. Everything will be passed away. It'll be forgotten. And then verse 13, somebody read it. All right. Now, he makes a statement here that you need to really pay attention to. He says, in the new covenant, by making a new covenant, he makes the other one old. The other covenant was not old until there was a new covenant. Meaning what? This is what makes things old. When we think about God, God is not old. I know it's a hard thing to fathom in your brain because you say, well, God is eternity years old, so he's definitely old. But he's not old. When you think about God sometimes, and if you ever seen a cartoon or a depiction of God, God always has this old gray beard and he looks old. And in that, the mindset is that God is old because old means disconnected. And truthfully, that's what makes somebody old, right? Is that they're disconnected. This is why many a person here has talked to somebody that in years might be old, but you can still talk to them. And you can still have a conversation with them, and just like anybody else. But then on the flip side, you may talk to somebody who isn't that many years old, and yet they act old. And you go, well, what's the thing? Because they're disconnected, and they haven't learned how things are operating still, and so they are old because they are pointless. But the person that is old in years, but is still relevant, isn't old because they are still relevant. And that's what he's talking about here. It wasn't that the old covenant was old and therefore was decrepit and useless. It was that the old covenant was now disconnected. And now the new covenant was connected. But the God who wrote them both never got old. In the same way that Jesus doesn't need to minister to the old covenant because Jesus isn't old. He's just been around a long time. But it doesn't mean he's old. He's not disconnected. He knows what's happening. He didn't lose his mind or get senile. He's God. He knows what's going on. And that's what makes the old covenant old, is that it's pointless. And that's why he says, now that which decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. Because it's become pointless and serves no purpose to anybody. It's just this old, stupid thing. And if it wasn't for the fact that we were reading our Bibles, it would have completely vanished away. You say, well, what about the people that still hold to it? No one holds to it. There's not one person on the planet that still holds to this. And you say, well, what about the Jewish religion? Jewish religion doesn't hold to this. You know how I know? They ain't got one. You know what that would mean? Every one of them's going to hell. Even they know that. So if you don't have the central thing of forgiveness, you don't hold to the thing. No one holds to it. It's old, it's decaying, it waxes old, and if it wasn't for a bunch of Christian preachers trying to show how good Jesus is, no one would even remember it at all. And that's what he's saying here. It's ready to vanish. And when all things are perfect, it will completely vanish away. No one's going to even remember about all the priests walking around killing the goats. They're not going to care about it. When we're in heaven and we see Jesus there, and even in the new tabernacle, it's going to be so much cooler. Like I say, this is a nice church building. I like it. Okay? But if we got a new one and a nicer one and a bigger one, I don't think anybody would be too upset about it. Right? They'd be like, all right, cool. Now, there's obviously going to be a couple old heads that are sitting around going, I remember when we were in the living room back in... Well, the point is, we like new, bigger, nicer church buildings, and that's fine. But there comes a day when no matter how nice of a church building you've been here on earth, you're going to be in the tabernacle that God built with his own hands, in the city that he built with his own hands. And if the tabernacle matches the volume of the city, we know what the city looks like, I can only imagine what the tabernacle is going to look like. And it's going to make all the other temples, all that glorious temple and Solomon's blah, 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 it's going to be lame when we're standing at the tabernacle of God that he built with his own hands, that Jesus is the high priest of. And it'll make everything else pointless and lame and a shadow. That's what he said. It's a shadow of the real thing. And the real thing exists now. And we're striving to get to the real thing now. It's not a mythical thing. It's a real thing. God bless you. You got church Thursday. We'll be diving into our Bibles. Read your Bible. Study the rest of Hebrews. We're going to be studying chapter 9 next week. So if you want to be ready, just read chapter 9. You know, you might be a little bit ahead and know what's happening. But God bless you. Go with God. God will go with you, Reverend Wallace. If you could dismiss us in prayer.